Gentlemen, gentlemen, please. I know tensions are high. I know both empires have soldiers standing 60 yards apart right now, muskets loaded, cannons primed, waiting for the order. But before either side fires the shot that starts the next great Anglo-American war, I think we should all take a moment to remember what actually started this. A pig. One pig. Historically, Facts, Part 6. Welcome to 1859 and welcome to a tiny, mostly forgettable cluster of islands sitting between Vancouver Island and the mainland of the United States, called the San Juan Islands. Genuinely gorgeous scenery, extremely low population, and crucially, extremely unclear ownership, which is exactly the kind of detail two competing empires love to leave unresolved for over a decade. The setup. Rewind to 1846. Britain and the United States signed the Oregon Treaty, which is meant to permanently settle the border between British North America and American territory in the Pacific Northwest. The treaty draws the line right down the middle of a body of water, splitting the two nations neatly, cleanly, no ambiguity whatsoever, except, and you can probably see where this is going, the treaty says the border runs through the middle of the channel. And it turns out there are two channels. Two perfectly valid, perfectly navigable channels, each one conveniently placing the San Juan Islands on a different side of the border depending on which one you pick. The British, understandably, picked the channel that put the islands in British territory. The Americans, equally understandably, picked the other one. Nobody actually fixed this for 13 years. Both governments just sort of let it sit there. Genuinely one of history's great examples of, we'll deal with that later. Except later took over a decade to arrive, and it arrived carrying a rifle. In the meantime, both British and American settlers just quietly moved on to the islands anyway, because apparently nobody told them the ownership was legally unresolved, or more likely, nobody cared. The British Hudson's Bay Company set up a sheep farming operation on San Juan Island itself, and American settlers started drifting in too, farming their own little plots right alongside the company's sheep pastures. Wonderful recipe for a peaceful, uneventful little island community. Enter Lyman Cutler, American farmer, recently arrived, growing potatoes on a modest plot of land that, again, may or may not have technically belonged to him depending on which channel you believed in. And enter, on the fateful morning of June 15th, 1859, a large black pig belonging to the Hudson's Bay Company, who, and I want to stress this is a completely accurate historical detail and not something I'm making up for comedic effect, wandered directly into Cutler's potato garden and started eating everything in sight. The incident. Now, this was not, according to most accounts, the pig's first offense. This particular pig had reportedly been getting into Cutler's potatoes on multiple previous occasions, which means by June 15th, Cutler had officially had enough. So Cutler did the extremely reasonable, extremely proportionate thing that any sensible farmer would do when faced with unresolved international boundary disputes, foreign livestock, and repeated property damage. He shot the pig, dead, on the spot, in his own potato garden. And listen, from a purely agricultural standpoint, I understand the frustration. Nobody wants their potatoes eaten repeatedly by a large, unrepentant British pig. But Cutler was about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between morally justified and legally advisable. The pig's owner, an employee of the Hudson's Bay Company, was, shall we say, displeased. Cutler reportedly offered $10 as compensation for the dead pig, which the owner rejected, demanding significantly more. Some accounts say up to $100, which for one single pig in 1859 is an absolutely wild valuation. But sure, let's go with it. Cutler, understandably, refused to pay $100 for a pig he shot for eating his potatoes and pointed out, not unreasonably, that the pig had been trespassing on his land in the first place. The Hudson's Bay Company representatives responded by threatening to have Cutler arrested and removed from the island entirely by British authorities, which, if you're an American farmer living on disputed territory, is precisely the kind of sentence that makes you go find the nearest US military official and start talking very loudly about British aggression. The Escalation. Word of the dispute reaches American military authorities, And this is where a genuinely minor property dispute over a single dead pig transforms, with the sort of speed that should honestly concern historians more than it does, into an actual international military standoff. Brigadier General William S. Harney, stationed in the region and according to most historical accounts, not exactly known for his measured diplomatic restraint, hears about the incident and decides the appropriate response is to dispatch American troops to San Juan Island to protect American settlers from the British over a pig. He sends Captain George Pickett, yes, that Pickett, the same guy who's going to become spectacularly famous a few years later for a certain unsuccessful charge at a certain battle you may have heard of, with a company of soldiers to occupy the island. The British, who at this point have gone from mildly annoyed about a dead pig to there are now armed American soldiers occupying territory we believe to be ours, respond about the way you'd expect an empire to respond to armed foreign troops suddenly showing up on land they consider theirs. Which is to say, they send warships. 3 British warships arrive off the coast of San Juan Island, carrying, depending on which account you read, somewhere in the range of 2,000 British troops, dozens of cannons, and 1 Royal Navy officer, Governor James Douglas, who is very much prepared to remove the American presence by force if necessary. Pickett's company, for context, numbers around 66 men, 66 American soldiers, facing down 3 warships and roughly 2,000 British troops, over a pig that had already been dead for weeks. Both sides start reinforcing their positions. More American troops arrive. More British ships arrive. At the peak of the standoff, there are reportedly around 450 American soldiers with 14 cannons dug into earthworks on the island, facing off against 5 British warships carrying over 2,000 men and roughly 70 guns between them. For a pig. I need you to sit with that number difference for a second, because it's genuinely one of the most lopsided military standoffs in recorded history, and the only thing preventing an actual bloodbath at this point is that both commanding officers, somewhat miraculously, keep refusing to fire the first shot. The standoff Rear Admiral Robert Baines, the senior British naval officer on the scene, reportedly refuses direct orders from Governor Douglas to land troops and forcibly remove the Americans. His reported reasoning, and I'm paraphrasing slightly here but not by much, was something along the lines of, "I am not going to involve 2 great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig." Genuinely, one of the most sensible sentences uttered by anyone during this entire ordeal. Meanwhile, both sides sit there, fully armed, fully mobilized, staring at each other across the water and the earthworks, for weeks. Soldiers on both sides reportedly start getting bored enough to occasionally exchange friendly taunts and, in some accounts, even trade goods and pleasantries across the lines. Because when you put several hundred armed men in close proximity for months with nothing actually happening, they eventually just start being normal humans about it. Word of the standoff eventually reaches Washington and London, and both governments, upon learning that their respective militaries had assembled a combined force of thousands of soldiers and warships over 1 dead pig, react with roughly the horrified embarrassment you'd expect. Both sides agree to de-escalate. American troop numbers are reduced. British warships pull back. And in a resolution that honestly feels almost anticlimactic given everything that led up to it, both nations agree to a joint military occupation of the island, splitting it between a small American camp and a small British camp, while the actual question of ownership gets kicked upstairs to international arbitration. Which takes, and I want you to really appreciate the commitment to bureaucratic slowness here, 12 more years to resolve. The joint occupation. For the next 12 years, genuinely over a decade, American and British troops peacefully coexist on San Juan Island at separate camps, essentially just living there. Reports from the era describe surprisingly friendly relations between the 2 camps, including shared social events, and by most accounts, this becomes one of the most bizarrely pleasant military occupations in history, considering it started with several thousand troops nearly opening fire on each other. Finally, in 1872, the dispute gets referred to an international arbitrator to settle once and for all. Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany, who, for reasons that remain somewhat unclear beyond everyone else agreed he seemed neutral enough, gets handed the job of deciding which channel the original 1846 treaty actually meant. The Kaiser's Arbitration Commission rules in favor of the United States, awarding the San Juan Islands to American territory on the boundary line the Americans had been arguing for the entire time. The British withdraw their remaining troops, the Americans get the islands, and the pig, having started the entire international crisis, remains to this day the only casualty of the Pig War. Not one single human being died. In an armed standoff involving thousands of troops, dozens of cannons, and multiple naval warships, over a period spanning weeks of active military tension and 12 years of joint occupation, the only fatality across the entire conflict was one single Hudson's Bay Company pig, shot in a potato garden by a man who was, in fairness, extremely tired of that pig specifically. Closing. So here's what actually gets me about the Pig War, once you step back from it. This wasn't a border dispute that happened to have a funny nickname attached to it after the fact. The pig is not a metaphor. The pig is not a footnote. The pig is, quite literally, the entire inciting incident, the single spark that took an unresolved 13-year-old treaty ambiguity and turned it into thousands of armed soldiers pointing weapons at each other across a few hundred yards of island. And somehow, remarkably, both sides managed to walk away from the brink without a single shot fired at another human being, largely because a handful of individual officers, a British admiral who refused to start a war over a pig, an American commander who kept his cooler head, and just enough shared common sense on both sides, decided that an actual war over an actual dead pig was, in fact, a genuinely stupid reason to go to war, which, respectfully, more conflicts throughout history could have stood to learn from. Lyman Cutler, for what it's worth, never did pay for that pig. He offered $10. He was asked for $100. And in the end, an international boundary dispute involving two global empires got settled by the German Kaiser before anyone ever actually resolved the original $10 disagreement. This has been the Pig War, the conflict where thousands of soldiers, dozens of warships, and two competing empires spent over a decade in an armed standoff, and the only blood spilled belonged to a pig who really liked potatoes. Subscribe!